It's a strange question. How did scientists first realize they weren't human? Of course, they were human. They were men and women made of flesh and bone, just like us. But the question gets at something deeper. It's about how scientists realized that the idea of human, with a capital H, was wrong. For most of history, being human meant being special. It meant we were separate from the animal kingdom. We were the pinnacle of creation made in God's image. Animals were beasts. They were below us, serving us. We had souls, reason, and language. They had instinct. This wasn't just a religious idea. It was the bedrock of philosophy, culture, and science for centuries. It was the default setting for what it meant to be us. We were not animals. We were human. The story of how scientists realized this was wrong is not a single aha moment. It wasn't one person in a lab coat looking at a test tube and shouting, "Eureka! We're apes!" It was a long, slow, and often reluctant process. It was a chipping away at the pedestal we had built for ourselves. It happened over centuries, through different fields of science. It was a mystery solved by many detectives, each finding a small clue. The clues came from dusty bones, from the bodies of strange new animals, from the layers of the earth, and eventually from the code inside our own cells. The first cracks in the wall of human specialness came not from trying to dethrone humanity, but from trying to understand God's creation. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a new passion for order swept through science. Naturalists wanted to categorize every living thing, to put it in its proper box, to map out the grand design. A Swedish botanist named Carl Linnaeus was the master of this. He created a system for naming and organizing life that we still use today, the system of genus and species, the Homo sapiens. He gave us that name, but Linnaeus had a problem. When he applied his own scientific rules, his system of looking at physical similarities, he found he had no choice. Based on our teeth, our hands, and our overall body plan, he had to place humans in the same group as monkeys and apes. He called this group the primates. This was a radical act. He wasn't saying we evolved from them. He was a deeply religious man who believed in creation, but he was also an honest scientist. And he couldn't ignore the evidence of his own eyes. By grouping us with the apes, he breached the sacred wall. He suggested we were not a unique creation, but a variation on a theme. For the first time in a scientific text, we were formally classified not as a thing apart, but as one animal among others. Around the same time, explorers were bringing back strange creatures from distant lands. In 1699, an English physician named Edward Tyson got his hands on the body of a young chimpanzee from Africa. He dissected it carefully. He was a brilliant anatomist. As he worked, he was stunned. The chimp's internal organs, its muscles, its brain, were shockingly similar to a human's. He counted over 40 ways in which the chimp was more like a human than a monkey. He called it an orang-outang, which was a general term for apes at the time. He concluded it was not a human, but it was not quite a beast either. It was some kind of link, a step on the ladder of nature between animal and man. He didn't understand what it meant, but he documented it. He had found another clue, the uncanny physical resemblance. These early anatomists and classifiers were just describing what they saw. They weren't proposing a new history for humanity. But their work raised uncomfortable questions. If we looked so much like apes, what did that mean? Were we just a fancier model? The old idea of a great chain of being, where every creature had its fixed place on a ladder leading up to God, started to seem a little too simple. Maybe it wasn't a ladder with neat rungs, maybe it was more like a branching bush. The next set of clues came from deep within the earth. For centuries, people had been finding strange, stony objects buried in the ground. Some looked like giant bones, others looked like seashells on mountaintops. The common explanation was that they were tricks of nature, or maybe the remains of dragons, giants, or creatures that died in Noah's flood. But a few thinkers began to suspect the truth. These were fossils. They were the remains of creatures that were no longer alive. This was a deeply troubling idea. The belief was that God's creation was perfect and complete. Nothing had been lost. Extinction meant that God's design had gaps in it, that parts of it had failed. It was almost unthinkable, but the evidence kept piling up. Georges Cuvier, a French naturalist in the early 19th century, became the master of fossils. By comparing the bones of extinct creatures like mammoths to modern elephants, he proved beyond any doubt that extinction was real. But entire worlds of creatures had lived and vanished long before humans came along. This opened up a new dimension to the story of lifetime. The world was clearly older than the few thousand years suggested by a literal reading of the Bible. But how much older? Geologists started to find the answer. Men like James Hutton and Charles Lyell looked at the slow, gradual processes they could see happening today: rivers carving valleys, sediment building up in layers, volcanoes erupting. They realized that to create the vast canyons and mountain ranges of the world, these processes must have been going on for an unimaginable amount of time. Lyell argued for a principle called uniformitarianism: the same natural laws we see today have always been at work. The earth wasn't shaped by sudden, biblical catastrophes. It was shaped by slow, relentless change over millions upon millions of years. This concept of deep time was perhaps the most important single realization on the path to understanding our place in nature. It was like discovering that the stage for the play of life wasn't a small room but a vast open continent. With only a few thousand years, there wasn't enough time for big changes, but with millions of years, anything was possible. Slow, gradual transformation was no longer out of the question. The Earth was old enough for a completely different story of life to have unfolded. This was the world a young naturalist named Charles Darwin stepped into. The pieces were all there, but nobody had put them together. The scientists knew about the similarities between humans and apes. They knew about extinct creatures. They knew the Earth was ancient, but there was no mechanism to connect it all. How could one species turn into another? It still seemed like magic. Darwin was not a man who set out to overthrow the world order. He was a quiet, methodical observer of nature. On his famous voyage aboard the HMS Beagle, he collected thousands of specimens. He saw things that didn't fit the old story. In South America, he found fossils of giant extinct armadillos in the same place where smaller, living armadillos roamed. Why would a creator put similar but different creatures in the same spot at different times? On the Galapagos Islands, he saw that each island had its own unique type of finch or tortoise. They were all clearly related, but they were adapted to the specific conditions on their own island. It looked less like a single act of creation and more like a family of creatures that had spread out and changed over time. For 20 years after his voyage, Darwin obsessed over this puzzle in private. He read, he experimented, he thought. He read an essay by an economist named Thomas Malthus who argued that human populations always grow faster than their food supply, leading to a constant struggle for existence. And that's when the idea clicked. It was beautifully simple. Darwin called it natural selection. He realized that in any population of creatures there is variation. Some individuals are a little faster, a little stronger, a little better camouflaged. And in the constant struggle for life, not all of them can survive and reproduce. The ones with a slight edge, the ones best suited to their environment, are more likely to make it. They pass on their advantageous traits to their offspring. The ones without that edge are more likely to die off. Over generations, and over the vastness of deep time, these small advantages accumulate. A population can slowly change, adapting to its surroundings, and over enough time, it can change so much that it becomes a whole new species. Blind, mechanical process, there was no goal, no design, no guiding hand. It was just variation and survival. It explained the finches on the Galapagos. It explained the fossil armadillos. It explained everything. It explained us. Darwin knew the terrifying implication of his theory. In his groundbreaking book On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, he barely mentioned humans. He only included one cryptic sentence at the very end saying that light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. He didn't need to say more. Everyone knew what he meant. If all life evolved through natural selection, then humans must have too. We weren't a special creation. We were the result of the same messy, unguided process that created beetles and barnacles. We must have evolved from some earlier, non-human ancestor. The idea was met with outrage, ridicule, and fascination. The image of a stooped, hairy ape man became a popular cartoon. But for many scientists, it was like a light turning on in a dark room. It made sense of all the scattered clues. The anatomical similarities with apes were no longer just a curiosity, they were a sign of shared ancestry. The existence of fossils was no longer just a record of extinction, it was a record of the evolutionary path. But there was still a big piece missing: a human fossil record. Darwin's theory predicted that we should find the remains of our ancestors, creatures that were intermediate between apes and modern humans. At the time, there were very few. A strange, thick-boned skull had been found in Germany's Neander Valley in 1856, a few years before Darwin published his book. Some thought it was a modern human with a disease. Others thought it was a brutish, primitive race. And Thomas Huxley, a fierce defender of Darwin, argued it was an ancient human relative. The Neanderthal was the first piece of fossil evidence that other kinds of humans had existed and gone extinct. Then, the discovery started to trickle in. In the 1890s, a Dutchman named Eugene Dubois found a skull cap and a thigh bone in Java. The thigh bone showed the creature walked upright, but the skull cap was primitive, with a small brain and a heavy brow ridge. He called it Pithecanthropus erectus, the upright ape man. It was exactly the kind of intermediate form Darwin's theory predicted. In the 1920s, a small fossil skull of a child was found in a quarry in South Africa. And Raymond Dart, an anatomist, recognized it as a new kind of ancestor, an Australopithecine, or southern ape. It had an ape-sized brain, but its teeth were human-like, and the position of the spinal cord showed it walked on two legs. The real flood of evidence came from East Africa, starting in the 1950s with the work of Louis and Mary Leakey. In the sun-baked layers of Olduvai Gorge, they uncovered a treasure trove of fossils. They found stone tools alongside the bones of early humans like Homo habilis, the handyman. Then, in 1974, Donald Johanson's team in Ethiopia discovered the skeleton of a female Australopithecine they nicknamed Lucy. She was tiny, with long arms and a small brain, but her pelvis and leg bones proved she walked upright just like us over 3 million years ago. Here was the undeniable proof written in stone and bone. The story of our origins wasn't a single event, but a long, branching journey. Our ancestors were not modern apes, but we shared a common ancestor with them millions of years ago. Our lineage was full of experiments and dead ends, with different species of human-like creatures, or hominins, walking the earth at the same time. We, Homo sapiens, are just the last branch left on a once bushy family tree. The pedestal of human uniqueness was now completely shattered. We weren't just descended from animals, our own family history was a long parade of them. The final conclusive chapter in this story was written not in rock, but in the language of life itself, DNA. In the mid-20th century, scientists discovered the molecular structure of DNA, the code that builds every living thing. For the first time, we could read the instruction manual, and by the end of the century, we could compare the manuals of different species. The genetic evidence was the ultimate confirmation of what Darwin had suspected and the fossils had shown. When scientists compared the human genome to that of our closest living relative, the chimpanzee, the result was staggering. Our DNA is somewhere between 98 and 99% identical. The tiny differences are what account for everything that separates us. But the overwhelming similarity is a clear, unambiguous signature of our shared ancestry. Genetics allowed scientists to do things they could only dream of before. They could build precise family trees showing how closely related different species are. They could even create a molecular clock by counting the number of genetic differences between two species, which accumulate at a roughly constant rate. They could estimate how long ago their ancestral lines split. The molecular clock told us that the human and chimpanzee lineages diverged around 6 or 7 million years ago. We can even see the evolutionary story written in our junk DNA, the parts of our genetic code that don't seem to do anything. We share the same types, the same broken genes with apes. The odds of two species independently getting the exact same genetic mistakes in the exact same places are astronomically low. The only logical explanation is that we inherited those mistakes from a common ancestor who had them. It's like finding two books by different authors that have the exact same unique spelling errors on the same pages. One must have been copied from the other, or they were both copied from a common source. So, how did scientists first realize they weren't human in that old special sense? They realized it when Linnaeus, trying to organize nature, had to put us in a box with the apes because the physical evidence was undeniable. They realized it when geologists like Lyell looked at a cliff face and saw not the work of a few days, but the history of 1,000,000 years, giving evolution the time it needed to work. They realized it when Darwin stood on the shores of the Galapagos and saw not a collection of perfectly designed creatures, but a family of related beings, all shaped by the ruthless impersonal logic of survival. They realized it when fossil hunters pulled the bones of Neanderthals, of Lucy, of the handyman from the earth, and saw the faces of our long-lost relatives staring back at them. And they realized it, finally and completely, when they looked at the strings of A's, T's, C's, and G's in our own DNA, and saw the echo of a chimpanzee's, a testament to a shared past written in the core of our being. The realization was not a loss, but a transformation. It took away our claim to be separate from nature, but it gave us a much grander story. We are not fallen angels. We are risen apes. We are the product of 4 billion years of evolution on this planet. We are connected through an unbroken chain of ancestors to every living thing. The blood in our veins and the DNA in our cells is a legacy of that immense journey. Realizing we weren't human in the old way allowed us to understand what it truly means to be human, a thinking, feeling, curious part of the vast and wonderful animal kingdom.